a topic that has been, I've certainly been in multiple sessions at this IGF to talk about multi-stakeholder best practices, but particularly how we can understand multi-stakeholder best practices in the context of the Net Mondiale plus 10, which took place in May this year, and which produced this document. It's not an official document produced by the UN, but it's a document that was created in a bottom-up way, and which is, I think, really owned by all the people that were part of that process. And I'm going to ask some of our panelists. I'm going to stray a little bit from the script. I hope I have your permission. And then also the Global Digital Compact, this new process which became formalized at the Summit of the Future in September this year in New York, which gives very strong endorsement for the multi-stakeholder approach. And then, of course, the World Summit on the Information Society, the UN process that I think consolidated and mainstreamed the idea of multi-stakeholder collaboration as being, I think, generally a good idea. But in the case of the information society, the internet and digitalization, it's kind of a non-negotiable. You can't actually do anything really effectively in development and digital and human rights and inclusion if you do not have effective collaboration and participation from the private sector, the technical community, governments, and civil society. And I know we don't always have them as a separate group, but the academic and research community, think tanks, and researchers all around the world. So what we want to achieve, I want to check if Ramsha from GNI is online yet. Ramsha, I'm looking for you online. I don't see you yet. But just to emphasize what the goal of this workshop is, we really want to look at where are there gaps and what are the key challenges and what are the opportunities that we can take from all these processes that I've just mentioned to really strengthen multi-stakeholder engagement using the IGF and coordinating and synergizing how we strengthen multi-stakeholder engagement. I think what the Net Mondiale guidelines told us is that it's not just in this multi-stakeholder arena that we need to strengthen our processes. Ah, fantastic, Flavia, welcome. It's also in the multilateral space. But just to get us started and I think also to make sure there's a level playing field. And I think everyone, I want you to, I will open the audience, but I want people to raise their hands. I think we are on day 3 of the IGF. You've discussed many of these issues. So I'm going to ask people in the room to interrupt. If you want to say something at any point, put up your hand. As long as you brief, it's absolutely fine, so that we can have very dynamic interaction between the panelists and the room, assuming that's okay. But I think I want to start and ask Bruna. I said earlier that the Net Mondiale plus 10 and the Sao Paulo guidelines has very strong ownership from those who created it. It might also have had gaps. But can you just tell everyone in very brief terms what was Net Mondiale plus 10? What are the Sao Paulo guidelines? And why is there both, on the one hand, strong ownership, but on the other hand, also a feeling that it's not official enough?
Thanks, Amriat, and thanks for the invitation. I think that looking back at Net Mondiale plus 10, it was a community-oriented and steered process, right? Net Mondiale was multi-stakeholder from its very beginning. It's an initiative that was shifted towards by the Brazilians, NIC.PR, but in the previous edition by the government. This year we had a huge support from the government yet. In terms of the ownership, I think it's because it's set for itself the challenge of addressing all of the gaps we perceived from the GDC process and attempted to improving that. The São Paulo guidelines, they are a set of principles and process steps as a how-to for effective implementation of multi-stakeholder in internet governance and digital policy, right? And the goal, and in doing so, we must also look forward to implementing openness, inclusiveness, and agility in internet governance, as well as the need for all stakeholders to be well informed. So I think, like in very brief words, I think the ownership comes from that. It is a community bottom-up initiative. It lies a lot on the success of the first edition of the initiative, and last but not least, it aims in addressing all of the gaps that we saw throughout the GDC process. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that, Bruna. And I didn't introduce my panel. I was waiting for Flavia, but that Bruna is from civil society. She can tell you more about herself. She's a member of the IGF Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group. So one of the people that organized this event and that we are part of. And also was on what was the body?
The high-level executive committee.
The high-level executive committee of Net Mondial +10. So just to jump into the kind of substance of multi-stakeholder collaboration. I mean, Isabel, it's become quite a buzzword. We talk about it. Some governments are more explicit about how they support it, how they use it. Some governments are more cautious about how and when they use it. But from your perspective, Isabel is with Ofcom, the Swiss government's Office on Communications, so very much right inside government, but very active in multiple multi-stakeholder processes. But what do you think governments should do to deliver on this promise and potential of multi-stakeholder processes? And what do you think they are, certainly in your experience, what are they doing well, and what do you think they're not doing well?
Thank you, Henriette. That is a great question and a very difficult question to answer. I think government can and should play a vital role in assuring that we have inclusive and open processes. I think the main point and our main responsibility as governments is to ensure that all of the relevant voices are being heard and are being listened to and are being taken into account. But the really difficult part is how can we do that, and where is our capacity to do that highlighted? I think governments have often a very strong convening power. We can sometimes set details on who will be included in a room in a discussion, and this is a power that we should use to make sure that everybody can be part of the conversation. So that means, on one part, being present in multi-stakeholder spaces, for example, at the IGF, be it at the international IGF, the regional ones, the national ones, so being very active in those processes, making sure that governments are also there and it's not just other stakeholders talking in between themselves, being part of the conversation, but also making sure within other structures and other forums that where there is a space and a need to include stakeholders, we make sure that they are all in the room with us. So I think that would be, for me, the main role and the main possibility for governments to do. And of course, this is much easier said than done. And there is a way forward. I think at least Switzerland tries its best to include all stakeholders in our discussions, in our conversations, make sure that if we are planning a panel, we are not just inviting governments to speak, and we are using our convening power as best as we can. But there is more that we can do, and I think we should push for that and include that in all processes. I think that is the main point I would say here.
I want to ask you just a follow-up question, and anyone else is welcome to respond as well. What is the difference between a government facilitating multi-stakeholder cooperation and a government living up to its constitutional obligations for public participation and policy making?
Oh, I think it's a very good question. I think a lot there enters in how does government include this perspective nationally, and how do they make sure that this is also included internationally? And I think this is a distinction that is not always very easy to navigate. I mean, for governments within their country and then internationally, in Switzerland, we have a very strong will, and we have a lot of public participation at the national level. We do a lot of consultations. We, have a semi-direct democracy, so we vote on many issues, and we have everyone sort of being part of the conversation at the national level. This is something we strive for and work for. And then at the international plane, this is where it becomes a bit more complicated, because, first, we have to find an agreement between governments and between stakeholders. Who should be included? How should we include them? What is meaningful? How do we make sure everybody's in the room? And this is where we think that the Sao Paulo multi-stakeholder guidelines is a very useful tool to not just talk the talk, but actually walk the walk. It's a way for us to see what are the main questions we should ask ourselves. How do we make sure that these principles that we find valuable and necessary, how can we actually use them? So what should we include? How should we include? How do we make sure that if there is a power imbalance, we have thought about it and try to mitigate it as best as possible? Of course, it will never be perfect, but we can do better. And now we have a sort of roadmap on how we can do better. And I think this is very useful. And this is why it's such an important document to read and to include in our processes.
Thanks very much for that response, Isabel. I think, speaking from civil society and someone who does a lot of not all, but a lot of my work in Africa, what you said actually, I think mirrors. I think many governments who have some reservations about the multi-stakeholder approach don't really have it about working at national level. They're much more comfortable. They work very closely with the private sector at national level. Civil society sometimes thinks they work too closely with the private sector at national level. They also collaborate with civil society and grassroots organization. It's when you get to a global forum that there's more caution about that multi-stakeholder approach. And I think that's exacerbated by the fact that many developing country governments already feel fairly disempowered in global arenas. And when they feel they have to not just be effective and influential to, in relation to countries that are much more powerful and rich and influential than they are, but also deal with the multi-stakeholder community, it is quite challenging. But Bruna, as a member of the MAG, what are the lessons? And the MAG is a multi-stakeholder advisory group. It's supposed to be perfect. And it's been going for a long time. This is the, how many at IGF? 19th IGF. What do you think we can learn from the IGF? And, when in applying the multi-stakeholder approach, what are we doing wrong? What are we doing right?
Maybe I'll start by saying that I think 2024 has been one of those inflection points, right? Or years where the internet governance space was all sorts of crazy or dynamic in that sense. Everyone was talking about WSIS plus 20, GDC, Pact for the Future, what is going to happen with the IGF, how ICANN is going to react to those spaces, what happens with the ATF, and many of those things, and how all of those missions or questions would be integrated, right? We had a lot of meaningful processes. We had a lot of all of them taking place at the same time. And I think that some of those spaces, like the GDC, in my personal opinion, they have presented a rather serious risk for the way we do things at the IGF, which is bottom-up, multi-stakeholder, and ensuring everyone has a say and has a microphone above all, right? And coming back to the IGF, I would say that this is the main value of this space, that everyone is here, gets to come here or gets to join sessions remotely, given that the remote participation is working. And at the same time, this is a space that relies a lot on the diversity of perspectives and not just in terms of the difference of opinions, but the difference in terms of backgrounds and expertise. This is a space where you hear to people from the Pacific, people from Brazil like me, or Tanzania, talking about different aspects around internet governance. And to me, that's one of the core aspects. So the big diversity around stakeholders, perspectives, backgrounds, and so on. And I would say that this is what makes the IGF one of the primary spaces for internet governance and digital cooperation related issues, because over the course of almost 20 years, the space has been leveraging on all of these vast community experts and expertises in order to move forward and to evolve its model. back to the challenges, I would say, to put it more bluntly, I would say that the tension to what the GDC seems to have catered between multilateralism and multi-stakeholderism is one of the challenges, right? And that is because there has always been somehow a clear ask for some member states for more silo discussions or exclusive mechanisms. And the point is that, right, we need to balance those two expectations. It's something that the São Paulo multi-stakeholder guidelines try to do by making some waves or some, signalization to the multilateral spaces, but one should not overcome the other. We should achieve for balanced spaces in that sense. So maybe I'll stop here, Riyadh. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Flavia, let's go to you. Flavia's from, oh, did you want to, oh, sorry. Thanks a lot. Flavia is from Meta, and Meta has really invested in time and people in participating in many of these spaces. Picking up from what Bruna said about this being a year of, I guess you use the term inflection point. We had the culmination of the Summit of the Future, the Global Digital Compact, and we have the WSIS Plus 20 process well underway now, and of course we have the IGF. How have you participated as a company in this process, and what, from your perspective, what works and what doesn't work?
Sure, thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Flavia Alves, Director of International Organizations for Meta. And I have been doing an internet governance and multi-stakeholderism processes for the past 20 years. From the 19 IGFs, I think I have been on half of them, so maybe a good chunk of IGFs. We, as Meta, we believe it's important to have a level playing field, that all stakeholders should be part of processes that deal with internet governance. Historically, we are in the pick, and I agree completely with Bruna, we are on the pick of diverse of multilateral and multi-stakeholder processes dealing with issues related to internet governance. If we go back to WSIS 2006 or WSIS Plus 10, or before WSIS Plus 10, there was a clear division between multi-stakeholderism and multilateralism, and what do we do in the multi-stakeholderism as opposed to multilateralism. One of them was internet governance, and that's why the IGF was created. Internet governance issues were supposed to be treated on a level playing field with all tech communities, civil society, private sector, governments, and international organizations would have a voice. Right now, we are in dealing with processes where private sector might not have had voices, including tech communities and civil society. We are looking forward to see what the UN Global Digital Compact implementation is going to be. But the reality is that through the process, which is multilateral processes, which I should have said in the beginning, there is a difference between multilateral processes that want to have input from other stakeholders through multi-stakeholder processes. In the case of multilateral processes, I believe that the Global Digital Compact could have got a little bit more of participation from civil society, private sector, and tech community. And then be transparent on how those comments or etc. were intaken and uptaken by the Global Digital Compact. We participated at the WSIS Plus 10 in the past, and there was no opening processes for consultations. There were consultations that were taken into account into a final document, and then a final document for folks to have comments on. Everything is still on the UN website. We have like dates and meetings. We were in the room during WSIS Plus 10. I would have hoped that the Global Digital Compact was similar, and then I'm hoping the WSIS Plus 20 will be similar. We have an opportunity, and I think Meta is going to try as much as possible to be together with tech community and civil society to be part of the WSIS Plus 20 process, to work with the co-facilitators to make sure there are consultations, we are in the room and that we are providing comments to the several documents that are going to come. And I think we have those opportunities through the several other multi-stakeholder process that we have into then. There is the ICANN meeting, there will be other conference, but there is also IGF in Norway before the WSIS. And so I would invite this community for us to work closely together to see how and what do we want from WSIS Plus 20. There is also the discussion, are we going to be able to build upon what WSIS plus 10 has agreed on that resolution? Are we open for new comments? And then we need to map out which issues do we want to address as a community, as a multi-stakeholder community. What are the issues that are there that we should be readdressing now? There are issues that, unfortunately, I think we're going to have a lot of challenge conversations to be able to agree on. To say the least, one on internet governance or another on human rights. However, there is the renewal of the IGF. And I think we all want to renew the IGF, I would assume. The question here for this group is also, how do we make the IGF even more relevant for others so that we can have more governments present, more civil society, and even more colleagues of ours and other tech peers, private sector community present here. Meta is committed to the IGF. And then through the years, as the IGF changed location, etc., we increased our participation back again after COVID. This year we had presence, like a global diverse delegation from all over the regions but Europe. And so I'm at Asia, LATAM, NORAM, as well as content experts. So we had safety, privacy, and I talking to stakeholders in every little corner here, because we believe it's important for us to exchange, and the power of IGF among all is also the convening power that it brings. So I hope that we can continue that spirit and we can continue to invest in these processes, but together. If we go in silos, just as Bruna just said, governments sometimes want to work in silos. I think the other communities, we should come together. The tech communities, the civil society, private sector, just as we do at the ITU, a multilateral forum where we all have a sit. So I guess I would stop there, otherwise I could go for years.
I mean, it all makes sense, but I think what I don't hear is what does it mean to not work in silos? You know, what does it mean to all come together? Do we all just come to the IGF? It's a multi-stakeholder space. We all sit together. We talk together, but does it make it? Do we really effectively? Are we effectively able to engage about this is where there's a common interest, this is where there's a divergent interest? Do we come together as sectors, or do we come together as individual companies, individual governments, individual civil society organizations? I think we sometimes romanticize the past of the WSIS and the wonderful WSIS multi-stakeholder process. What we forget, those of us who were there at the time, like Tijani and myself, is that we had bureaus. We had a civil society bureau, we had a private sector bureau, and governments, of course, have to negotiate with one another. And we had, within civil society, before every opportunity to give an input on an item of the agenda, we had to reach internal consensus. And it was very, very difficult. But we had to, and we were given the space by the WSIS process to meet, and we were forced to reach consensus, and then our consensus statement was given to governments, and governments took our consensus statements quite seriously. The same thing with the private sector. You did not have individual companies submitting their views. Businesses had to work together and decide these are our priorities. And I think we sometimes forget that to have effective multi-stakeholder collaboration, you need coherent stakeholder processes within those stakeholder groups. And I think the same applies for regional multi-stakeholder processes. For Africa to have a strong voice in the global IGF or in the WSIS, Africa has to have a strong regional multi-stakeholder process, but it also needs a strong regional multilateral process. So I'm trying to unpack a little bit, I think we all believe in this modality. We believe in the multi-stakeholder approach, but I think we recognize that it needs to be better. I think Net Mundial Sao Paulo Guidelines is trying to make us do that. And I guess my final challenge, and I want you all to react to this, is that it takes resources. I think sometimes we look at the multi-stakeholder approach as a more cost-effective approach because we put everyone in the same space. But is effective multi-stakeholder processes not also actually quite resource and time intensive? But I've now challenged the panel, but I want to open it to the room and also online. If there's anyone who wants to ask a question, or make a comment, and then we'll go back to our panel. Tijani, please, can we have a mic? Can we ask one of our, excuse me, the volunteer on her cell phone in the back of the room? Sorry, can you help us with the microphone, please? Thanks, Flavia. I'm kind of doing it out of principle.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And very much.
Tijani, just introduce yourself and be brief.
Yeah. Oh. Okay, my name is Tijani Benjama. I am from Tunisia, civil society from the beginning. And yet, I really thank you for asking what does mean working in silos. We know that governments want to work in silos, but what about the other stakeholders? Are there have there any kind or any aspect of multi-stakeholder in their work, in their do they consult with civil society? Do they consult with governments? This is a very important point. When we speak about multi-stakeholder model, we speak about it for all the stakeholders, not only for the governments. Thank you.
Any other comments? Any other comments from the question? Please go ahead from the floor.
Is that working? Hi, my name is Lena. I'm with Search for Common Ground, a peace-building organization, and the Council on Tech and Social Cohesion. I wonder whether or not we're being honest enough about the relationship between governments, the UN, civil society, and big tech. Because it feels like the only things that are actually making things move is litigation, certain regulations that threaten fines or extreme reputational damage. And sometimes I'm just not sure that these kinds of forums are really raising the issue. And I think it has changed, right? We have in billions of dollars of lobby funds going to countries that are trying to move the needle around certain regulations, so that those regulations don't happen. And I'm not seeing necessarily that big tech is wanting a coherence from a regulatory standpoint. And just to give an illustration of what I'm talking about, we've seen that when it comes to online safety, protection of women and children, the kinds of things that are on many panels here, that this information has been known by the companies for a long time, you know, and yet they're waiting until regulations in Europe force them to do different things. Meanwhile, the global South is not benefiting from any of those changes and protections. So I'm really trying to just see whether or not the multi-stakeholder model isn't being threatened by this, and are we being honest about that? Thank you.
Hello, Dana Kramer for the record, representing my youth IGF Canada. I'm curious about the panel. Can you hear me? Okay, sorry, it seems to be cutting in and out of my own. I'm curious if the panel can speak to implementation of the GDC and where it could be implemented. So kind of building off of the last question about our IGFs, are we seeing that practical element? And I'm wondering if the panel could maybe speak to points of would the IGF be the best place to implement the GDC so that there's an action-oriented outcome within it for some of those principles within the document for more safe internet, sorry, I'm just building a lot off of your question there, but where we can see some of this impact from multi-stakeholderism, because as mentioned earlier, with the resource constraints, that's easy when we're all kind of coming together, that if this would be the most appropriate venue. Thank you.
Thanks, Dana. And we have one more comment from online, and then I'll ask you to respond. Manal Ismail, let me just see if I can unmute you. I can unmute you. So please go ahead and introduce yourself. Manal is someone with a very deep track record in the multi-stakeholder process. I can't hear you. Can anyone else hear Manal? We have a remote speaker that's trying to speak. Manal Ismail, we can't hear her. I have unmuted her. Manal, try now.
Sometimes the audio is going to the table, but not to the speakers, neither here. So if you guys can change it.
And Manal, you can type your comment and I will read it, okay? I will look in the chat in the meantime. Let's just... Oh, she's speaking, but we can't hear you. Let's see if I can unmute you again. Last try. And we have one more question in the room. And Manal, just type your comment. I'm so sorry we can't hear you. The remote participants can hear you, but those of us in the room can't hear you. Whose hand was it, Aziz? Please go ahead.
Yes, I am Aziz Hilary from Morocco. I just want to add one quick question about what mechanism or criteria can ensure that multi-stakeholderism is authentic and not just rhetoric and just words. What mechanism and criteria we can apply to ensure that multi-stakeholderism is authentic?
Very, very tough. That's a tough question. It's okay. I think Manal says we should go ahead, but I really do ask our technical team to try and make sure that our remote participants can participate. Yes, quite a wide range of reactions there and challenging questions. Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I'll go.
Bruna.
Guess I'll go to Lina's point about the multi-stakeholderism and whether or not it works or it's been implemented. Brazil is one of those countries, right, that has been championing the multi-stakeholder model into policymaking, into law enforcement and some of those things. But again, we must not conflate the issues, right? The IGF is not a regulatory body. The IGF is a convening space for the discussion of ideas, and it doesn't has the interesting that they are muting everyone now. Can we please cut off the but just to say that the IGF has its general or initial idea of being a convening space for different thoughts and different approaches, but in any sense you have... Can we please stop the interference on the microphone? But in any case, Brazil has been implementing that, and just to quote two examples, we have the Civil Rights Framework for the Internet and also our Data Protection Act, which were all discussed and co-written by a group of stakeholders that were convened by the rapporteurs in the parliament, and which main idea was to make sure everyone had its position. And the point that I always kind of mention when there is this kind of tension between big tech and the rest put at the table is that when we talk about policy processes, governments talk to business because they have the financial interest. Governments talk to business, to other stakeholders, technical community, because of different interests. But there is nothing that makes them talk to civil society, depending on where you're coming from and where country you're going to. Obviously, if you master participation mechanisms and so on, that's one thing. But there's literally nothing that obliges governments to go to end users. And the multi-stakeholder model serves its purpose, that is bringing civil society to the table and making sure that here it's not a financial interest that's at play, but the needs for including everyone above all. So maybe that's kind of what I go, but yeah, I'll stop.
Flavia.
Hi, thank you. There are a couple of issues that I would like to address. Just picking up on this last one, just so that we get it first. First of all, we as Meta and I won't speak for other tech companies, are highly supportive of harmonization and interoperable approach of key critical issues. We also comply with regulation globally around the world, and we appreciate processes that are either interoperable or harmonized. In a sense, right now, you might be very well familiar with the Global Digital, the GDPR, also EU AI Act, or Digital Services Act, or Digital Market Access Act. And so there are DMA, DSI, they're all of these processes that we were part of the process as they were developing. And now we are working together with governments to try to implement it as much as possible. So I would say we are supportive of regulatory making processes that are open and then provide processes for us to provide our comments and together develop documents or regulations, as we said. Meta has always been proactive, supportive of regulation, particularly because we don't want to be the ones trying to and having to determine what we should or should not have in the internet. On the safety, here at IGF, we have child safety group that has been here for years. I think right now might have closed. And from that, we developed a community that today have continued working together on safety matters and have several different groups addressing online safety, particularly child safety issues. I can send you some of those details. My digital safety person is around here too, but that's something that I wanted to make sure you understand. This convening helps us develop in the community to understand what are the issues and how can we address that together with tech companies. We have several other groups as well. From the IGF perspective, and then coming back to Henriette and your comment, I do agree that sectors need to together come up with consensus. And for me, I cannot picture, because I wasn't at WSIS, but I cannot picture another process that worked as best as Net Mundial, the first and the second. So it was Net Mundial 2014 and Net Mundial plus 10. I remember perfectly most of us there having like the head of civil society, have everyone on the same level, and even on the podium, even on the negotiations, we each had a room, we each had a processes, and then we had to come up with a consensus on a single document with governments on the same level. Now, the document exists, and then we review it like last year. I think we should use this based for other processes, and perhaps that's where we want to go.
In fact, an interesting thing about Net Mundial is that imagine a room like this, but it's very, very big. And then you have different microphones, one for civil society, one for government, one for business, one for the technical community. And they have to line up. But of course, there are only so many speakers. Civil society usually has loads. And as a result, we as civil society had to negotiate. We had a WhatsApp group, we had a Google Doc, so that we could prioritize what, we only had 3 opportunities to speak, so we had to prioritize. So I think in a way it did capture that combination of stakeholders having to collaborate as well as be on a level playing field. But, I'm going to give the mic to Manal. But I also want to say, isn't the true test, to respond to the comment from Search for Common Ground, isn't the true test of an effective multi-stakeholder process that it should survive, even if there is serious disagreement on how to regulate and what to regulate, by whom? Isn't that ultimately what shows us that our multi-stakeholder processes has matured, that we don't abandon them when we reach points of conflict? Same with governments that have different perceptions, different understandings of human rights and compliance of human rights. Should we stop working with them because we disagree? But that's another challenge. Manal, please, I think it works now. The team has sorted the problem. So please go ahead and share your experience.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me now, Henriette?
We can.
Excellent. Thank you. So just very quickly, I was triggered by your comment that governments partner with civil society.
Please introduce yourself. Sorry, I didn't introduce you yet.
Sure. I'm sorry. This is Manal Ismail. I work at the National Telecom Regulatory Authority of Egypt, and I've been participating to almost all the IGF meetings, and in ICANN, I participated represented Egypt on the Governmental Advisory Committee in different capacities, last of which was chairing the committee. And just wanted to share the experience of government's participation to the Governmental Advisory Committee of ICANN. And as said, I was triggered by your comment, Henriette, that governments collaborate and partnership with civil society and private sector at the national level, but they are more cautious globally. And I think this could be attributed to, if I'm participating in an individual capacity, it's more easy and more flexible to just speak my mind. When someone is participating on behalf of the country, it is more difficult to speak up without really being prepared and consulted at the national level. We started the very first meeting I tried to participate to. I found the room was closed with a key. So it was a really closed government meeting. But over the years, we started opening up gradually. We opened up certain sessions, then all the sessions except the communique drafting. But now all the meetings are open, including the communique drafting. And I think a few things that help is, for example, sharing the topics and everything in advance so people can prepare and consult at the national level before they come, so they can speak more freely in public. And also availing in real-time interpretation also helped, because sometimes the language is a barrier and people are very cautious and careful in choosing each and every word because it's going to be attributed to their governments and their country. I'm cautious of time. I leave it at this, but just wanted to share with you that after we had very closed meeting with a key, now we're having all the meetings open, and we are also engaging with other parts of other stakeholder groups at ICANN, and thus benefiting from the multi-stakeholder nature of the organization. Previously, we were meeting in silos, all the stakeholders, but not in one meeting. I leave it at this. Thank you, Henriette, for the opportunity.
Thanks very much for sharing that, Manal. And I think it's a very good example of how one learns incrementally from processes. We have about 15 minutes left, and we want to look at what role the IGF can play in capturing this learning, capturing best practices and applying them. And I think we should also reflect, there's been a lot of talk about the Global Digital Compact, but I've also heard many people say that it's one of the most inclusive and collaborative processes that has been run from within the UN General Assembly. And I think I felt frustrated by it, but I also sometimes would talk to the co-facilitators and see how much additional work they had from normally just facilitating a negotiation between members of the UN General Assembly. They also tried to get in all this other stakeholder input. It was imperfect, but there was a serious attempt. So how do you think we can make these processes better? How do we use the Sao Paulo guidelines? And what do you see the IGF doing concretely? I mean, maybe it demonstrates, but maybe it can also innovate in making us get away from the sort of happy, wonderful, multi-stakeholder community to actually having deeper engagement that produces more concrete policy outcomes that might not always be consensus-based, but that are serving the broader public interest in the best possible way in the internet. So yeah, I know it's a very long question, but I know you've been thinking about this and you are in these spaces. So let's start with you, Isabel.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you for the question. Very, very long, and there's a lot of things. I just wanted to add one point on what we've said before that I think is very important. When we talk about inclusion, inclusion does not remove the power from the people who are already in the room, opening up to more stakeholders, more people, is not removing from those who are already there. And I think this is something we have to remember and underline in all of the processes. So this was just my first little point that I think is important to highlight. On what we can do and how we can use what has been, I mean, we have 20 years of experience of trying to be as multi-stakeholder as possible and try to be better. We now have some guidelines on how we can make it effective. And I think this is something we should use to not have moments where we believe a process or is multi-stakeholder just by name, because we name it, but without maybe actually being it. It's sort of a whitewashing, just because we're using this buzz term and not actually living it up. And I think this is something that we now have some sort of litmus test that we can use with the Sao Paulo guidelines of checking, is this truly multi-stakeholder, or is this just called a multi-stakeholder process? So I think this is one of the points that we can emphasize on. And for the IGF specifically, it is difficult to see what it could do. And I think there are probably many ideas, but one of the points I would like to highlight is on the messages. We have messages at the end of every IGF, and of course, these are not adopted by consensus. It's a sort of summary of what has been discussed, but it gives us a very good knowledge of what has been shared, what are the issues that are raised, what are the opinions that have been raised in the different rooms. And I think we could do much better in using those messages in other forums, bringing them, highlighting them, saying, okay, this was discussed at the IGF, these issues were identified, and then bringing them in the other conversation, in the other rooms where there might be regulation or decision-making, because the IGF is not a regulatory body. This is very important to highlight, but we are coming up with new ideas that might then just be lost in a document that is not read as much. So I think this is something where we can actively, we have the opinions of the different stakeholders. They are concretely written down, and we should use this more. So this would be my little point. I'm happy to give it to.
I think I'll start with the idea that for the upcoming hosts, we should also make sure that the host country selection process takes into account safety of participants, comfort around participants, and whether or not the community, or whether or not the selection will result in one part of the community being less present, right? My stakeholder group is one that's not present this year, or present in much smaller numbers, and it's one of the main stakeholders within the IGF space. To anyone that's here for the first time, this space is much more lively. I do miss my colleagues from Latin America, civil society, and many other spaces in this broader conversation. So maybe looking at the IGF, making sure that the host country selection takes into account new aspects around safety of participants and so on is one thing. And lastly, I would just echo some of the guidelines, not the guidelines, but the suggestions issued by the MAG working group strategy, because we just issued a vision document for the IGF looking into 2025. And a couple of the recommendations, they go around making sure the next year's events makes a couple of discussions on how to improve the IGF mandates, a couple more things on making sure that the IGF has a track for GDC follow-up and implementation, and brings into a lot of the GDC follow-up and implementation discussions to the workshops, main sessions, and everything that takes place. But also working on the development of relationships between the IGF and some of the WSIS partner institutions, and also continue some of the MAG discussions on Net Mundial plus 10 alignment, and last but not least, review and refine the intersessional work models. I'll just wrap this by saying that if we don't have every single, group and stakeholder group at the table, this doesn't work. And this goes both ways for civil society and private sector, for academia, and many other parts, government, many other parts of this community. There's not a multi-stakeholder model where we don't have one, or where we don't like one of them. And that's the kind of the perk of it all, and the joy of the IGF space.
Thanks. Thanks. you want to make a comment? I just want to react quickly to what Bruna said. I think, yes, all stakeholders are at the table, but I think what the Net Mundial Sao Paulo guidelines tells us, scope the issue that's being discussed. And based on that issue, identify who's affected by that particular discussion. And then you bring the stakeholders. If it's about meta and content regulation and gender-based violence, you bring together meta, you bring together feminist organizations, you bring together data brokers, regulators, and you bring together freedom of expression people, because any kind of content regulation might impact on freedom. So you have to, I think, be quite focused and targeted as well. And I think Net Mundial gives us steps to help do that. I said you could interrupt us, so you can, but you're going to have to get up and come and fetch your own microphone, because if I get up, I'm going to drop something. Thanks, Flavia.
Hello. Thank you so much for the mic. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Arjun Singh Vijoria. I am from India. Here I am representing a civil society organization called the Vijoria Foundation that is founded by me in 2016. We are working in India in rural sector for the digital literacy. Now my question is here: how a small scale organization can work with the IGF, and is there any space to work within with the IGF in the India for the small scale organization? And the second question is to the Meta. Sorry for the direct question, and I just want to know that how the Meta is dealing with the cyberbullying. Sometimes I using the Facebook or certain platform, I see certain messages that are not relevant to me. It's just like direct message. Someone is targeting. So how you are dealing with that? Yeah.
Answer that and then make your final remarks as well, and then you can answer the question about participating in national IGFs.
Let's talk on the side on this. I'm not an expert on cyberbullying.
Sure,
but we
sure.
are addressing it, and we have our head of safety here, so we can discuss with you.
Certainly.
I guess most of the points I was going to make, particularly with regard to multistakeholderism and IGF, were made by my excellent co-panelists. Particularly, I think one thing that I keep hearing is we need to map the issues. We need to say what are the issues, and this needs to be an evolving process. There is not a rule set in stone, and all issues that we were discussing 10 years ago are different from the issues we were discussing now. At that time, we wouldn't discuss content. Today, we have, a whole DSA and content regulation issues. We have the UNESCO information integrity, have the UN information integrity matters. And so I think we should take this into account as we prepare for the upcoming review of the IGF mandate. For the IGF, I would love for the IGF next year in Norway for us to start early the process, particularly the country with the hosts, to make sure we bring stakeholders from all groups. My group is also not too present here. And so I think we could partner in trying to make sure we bring others to the place. And with Norway, we agreed also to try to make available the list of participants earlier, so others have more incentive to be present, but also try to bring small businesses, small organizations, small countries, developing countries, and making sure the remote participation is there as well. So I would stop there. I know we are out of time.
Thanks very much, Flavia. And Bruna, maybe you can talk to Bruna about how to participate in the national, and absolutely national IGFs are completely open to any organization of any size.
Sure.
Well, I think, it feels again like we're almost scratching the surface of this, but I think that we should take this experience of the Global Digital Compact. I think it's an important experience where a multilateral institution tried hard to be consultative. The results might not be what we are used to or expect from the multi-stakeholder space. That doesn't mean that there wasn't good intention. I think it demonstrates how difficult it is. So I think let's look at that process, work with multilateral processes to make these processes that originate from within the United Nations system more inclusive. I think you've outlined very clearly how the IGF can become more effective. And my closing, this workshop was convened amongst others by a Global Network Initiative. And I want to quote Rebecca McKinnon. She's not not here, but she's the person that was the founder of the Global Network Initiative. And she always says it takes different types of initiative. There's no one fix to all of this. There's no one perfect process. And if we look at how we're making progress in using the multi-stakeholder approach to have more accountable, democratic, inclusive, digital and internet governance, it takes all these different types of processes. And it's kind of the imperfections of all of them together, I think sometimes, that really makes us be more effective and more inclusive. So thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks to our panel. Thanks to the remote participants. Sorry about the tech issues. And thanks very much, Manal, for your contribution as well.